I don't even know where to begin with this because so much happened in the last few days at the NATO summit. It was yesterday. It was what, July 11th and 12th. Okay, with some I'm in the United States, so there's some time zone issues, but a lot happened at this NATO summit. And of course, you have a coronation, right? I'm not going to read this whole article to you, but I'm going to show you that the Western corporate media, the Western mainstream media, has tried to paint the NATO summit as a big success, right? A big success for the Biden administration. And here we go. They say, despite successes at the NATO summit, divisions remain. So we need to talk about that. So here you see that at the NATO summit, some things did get done. Okay, some things indeed did get done. You had Sweden finally get the nod, right? It's finally going to be able to formally join NATO after Turkey decided to basically end its year-long resistance to membership of Sweden. So that is going to happen very soon. You also have these so-called, as New York Times calls it, new ambitions for itself and long-term support for Ukraine. Read that, nothing changed there. These countries, the collective West, were always going to support Ukraine through and through in a type of permanent warfare. So nothing really changed there. Promising NATO membership someday, they said. And this is what we really need to talk about, because it says here Kiev wanted more. So I'm not going to read you the whole article, but the point is this is kind of how to summarize what happened at the NATO summit. You had on the one hand Turkey, and this isn't the first thing that Turkey did leading up to this summit that indicated that it was going to give major concessions to the collective West. You also had Turkey basically stabbing Putin in the back, saying that Ukraine deserved NATO membership in the days leading up. I was in China following this at the time, basically saying that Ukraine deserved NATO membership, holding pretty high-level talks with NATO counterparts, and then at the summit, essentially saying, Sweden, you can have NATO membership. Now I'm going to let go of support. Turkey did get concessions, and so I understand that there is this tit for tat. But in the main, in my opinion, this is something that Erdogan and Turkey has done in the past to Russia, become close, but then, of course, kind of stab them in the back. You know about Turkey shooting down the Russian plane during the war on Syria, during Russia's assistance to Syria. A lot of complexities in that relationship between Turkey and Russia. But the point is that Sweden is now in NATO. Now, there are now new so-called security assurances to Ukraine, supposedly, but not really. So this is what is so important to note about this summit, is that Ukraine really got nothing. And so the memes were abound. Just check the thumbnail of this stream, okay? The memes were abound of Zelensky with a janitor's broom, a janitor's mop. This is how tall you need to be to join NATO, because Ukraine got no assurances that it would ever really join NATO, other than maybe someday you will. And this really angered Zelensky. And this was a hilarious exchange that exposed the outright corruption of this whole arrangement between the collective West, between NATO and Ukraine. Because what you essentially had was Kiev begging and hoping that this was going to be the summit, that they were assured, not just assured membership, but given the specific conditions for how they were going to join NATO. And NATO said, nope, we're not going to give you conditions. Actually, we're just going to let you know the conditions when we know them, and then you're just going to have to meet them even if you don't know them. This is how absurd all of this is. This is how absurd all of this is. Basically, NATO said to Ukraine, not this time, and I'll tell you why. It's because Ukraine isn't doing well. The whole point of this summit was supposed to be a victory lap. It was supposed to be Ukraine's spring counteroffensive being successful so that NATO could say with assurances that yeah, Ukraine, you did a good job. Thank you. And now you'll get membership into NATO. But that's not what happened. And that's exactly why there were major divisions at this summit. So let's talk about one of these divisions. And it probably is the most important one. It is the division between NATO and Zelensky, between Washington, really, and Zelensky. So this kind of came and went, but it was still significant because NATO eventually tamed Zelensky and petted him on the head and said, be careful what you're doing there, son, because we will take care of you if you say the wrong thing again. So while this came and went, it still indicated something very important in that there is trouble in the waters in this conflict. So here you have the United States was furious about a tweet that Zelensky made at the NATO summit, while at the NATO summit, when he found out that there wasn't specific security guarantees that included the specifics to a pathway toward NATO membership. He said that the bloc's indecisiveness about Kiev joining the NATO alliance was a sign of quote unquote weakness. So the U.S. delegation that was attending the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, is furious, quote unquote, over a tweet by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in which he criticized the military alliance for its reluctance to provide a concrete roadmap for Kiev's accession to the bloc, the Washington Post reported. Now, mind you, in the lead up to the NATO summit, there was a scramble between Germany, the UK, all these countries were meeting together saying, how do we put together these conditions to satisfy Ukraine without actually satisfying Ukraine? Because that's what was actually going on. They didn't want to offer NATO membership from the beginning, and I'll get to that in a second. He called the omissions, this is what Zelensky said on Twitter, that he had been informed on the final text of the joint communique issued at the summit would not include a timeline for membership for Ukraine into NATO. He called it, quote unquote, unprecedented and absurd. And he suggested that this indecisiveness on the issue is a sign of weakness. Zelensky claimed that Kiev's Western backers had decided to bargain Ukraine's membership in NATO in negotiations with Russia. Members of the U.S. delegation were furious, they said, after learning about the Ukrainian leader's message. The paper pointed out that Zelensky blasting, this is the Washington Post, blasting the alliance stood in stark contrast to the image of Western harmony that U.S. President Joe Biden and his aides had been projecting at the event. So essentially what Zelensky was saying here, so that's the beginning of that's what happened, right? Zelensky says that he's fighting to the end. That actually NATO official told the Washington Post that Zelensky's tweet puts pressure on the alliance to say, I'm fighting to the end. So this is Zelensky in a power play. But most people in NATO, surrounding NATO, thought he went too far. And you know what? He probably did. Because let's be honest, this is something that Zelensky has been doing for quite some time. He has been, even though he's not a very big person, right? He's not, but he has been attempting to stand tall to the collective West only when it serves him, not the Ukrainian people, not the international order as a whole, not peace, not anything like that, not to maybe clean up the corruption, maybe stop supporting the fascists and the Nazis, none of that. Actually, when Zelensky has stood up to the collective West, what he really has been doing is throwing temper tantrums to them, saying, give me more, give me more. You remember U.S. Congress early in this conflict when he presented to U.S. Congress in his sort of military fatigue sweater getup. When he did that, you remember what he said. Thanks for your support, but it's not enough. Right? And this is after tens of billions of dollars of pledges. Now Ukraine has already received even more than that, nearly $100 billion. I believe it's $100 billion total, with over $50+ billion worth of weapons, over the last short period of time, right? This conflict is not that long still. It's only been about a year and a half. But over that year and a half, Ukraine has been pumped with tens of billions in weaponry, and still it's not enough. Now, Zelensky has a point to a degree. It really isn't enough because Russia steamrolled that counteroffensive. When was the last time you heard about this counteroffensive having any prospect for success? And this is why Zelensky is desperate for direct NATO intervention. That's why he was so angry. He's not angry for the Ukrainian people. He's not angry about Ukraine's sovereignty. He's not angry about the state of the world order. He is scared for himself. And that's why he lashed out in this way. And him lashing out really angered the United States. And you could say, on the one hand, that perhaps they should be angry. There's been a lot of talk about gratitude. And I got to say one thing about this whole gratitude. Yeah, Zelensky maybe should have more gratitude because NATO is really the single pillar holding up his bankrupt and corrupt and outright fascistic political rule. But at the same time, this is what you call a puppet gone mad. Zelensky is a puppet gone mad. He's not a legitimate political leader. He is the product of the 2014 coup. He conned his way into the 2019 election victory. He is backed by Kolomoisky, I believe his name is, this huge billionaire that basically bankrolled his campaign and used the campaign as a kind of propaganda arm of a kind of new regime that could basically and essentially fight this conflict with Russia to the last Ukrainian. So Zelensky's just a puppet gone mad. And I am not going to sit here and say he should have gratitude when it was NATO that created and spawned this monster, because that's what he is. He's a monster. That's what they all are. They're all monsters. They all sit around a table to plan and plot monstrous things on behalf of the military-industrial complex and Wall Street. That's what NATO is. U.S. hegemony projected with a European kind of North Atlantic alliance face. That is what NATO is. So Zelensky was very vocal, and it didn't last long, however, because by the second day of this summit, he had a different tune. He sang a different tune, Mr. Zelensky did. He wasn't talking so big anymore. Zelensky was much more amenable to what NATO had essentially accomplished during the summit, which in my opinion isn't much, but I'll get into that in a second. So Kiev understands, says Zelensky, that it cannot become a member of the bloc while in conflict with Russia, says the Ukrainian leader. The results of the NATO summit in Lithuania were very good, quote unquote, said Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, despite not receiving an invitation to join NATO. Ukraine is and always will be a donor of our common security, he said, insisting at the joint press conference with NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg in Vilnius on Wednesday. I think that Ukraine needs NATO as much as NATO needs Ukraine. Zelensky stated it is logical and understandable that some are afraid to talk about our membership in NATO because no one wants to start a world war. Oh, is that right, Zelensky? But just the day before, you were talking about how NATO essentially needs to have a really strict timeline for when you'll get membership. And really, you know what Zelensky wanted. He wanted membership to be to have a timeline as soon as possible. Right? He wants to be in NATO now because he wants to invoke Article 5 and say you have a responsibility to directly intervene against Russia, which would inevitably lead to world war. So this is Zelensky talking out of both sides of his mouth. But he continues that the G7 and U.S. allies are confirming guarantees today, and I'm sure it will happen. Now, those guarantees never came. There's no real guarantees here other than there will be more arming of Ukraine. There will be F-16s now going to Ukraine, but nothing that's going to change the course of the battlefield. No boots on the ground, no fly zone, nothing like that. Nothing that will change the situation on the ground at all. So Zelensky insisted that the G7's security guarantees. So this is what happened, right? When NATO couldn't agree to security guarantees, the G7 scrambled and said, oh, we'll give you security guarantees. Mind you, this is an economic bloc. This is not legitimate, right? This is not legitimate at all. Basically, if you're talking about the G7 giving security guarantees, you might as well be just living in a delusion. There's no such thing as a G7 security guarantees. These countries are blocked out of economic reasons, and they're just essentially trying to project that they have things figured out where NATO does not. So they shouldn't be a substitute, he said, however, for NATO membership. Security guarantees must be made on Ukraine's way towards NATO. So, according to Zelensky, Kiev also reached major agreements with Western backers regarding new military packages. A shortage of long-range weapons remains a problem for the Ukrainian military, Zelensky said, adding that he would raise this issue during talks with U.S. President Joe Biden. Zelensky lashed out at NATO on social media, claiming its indecisiveness on Ukraine's membership bid was a sign of weakness. So, there you go. He changed his tune. He said, on the one hand, that Ukraine is unhappy, right? That he is unhappy that they did not receive a timeline for NATO membership and called NATO weak. And then the next day he says, oh, wait. Actually, what came out of this summit is in fact beneficial. We did get what we wanted except for NATO membership. That's it, right? So that is how you tame and discipline a puppet. Basically, what Zelensky was told was, you went a little too far there, buddy, and you got to rein it in. So those are the major stories of the NATO summit, really. And now it's time, right? Because you had Turkey, okay? You had Turkey allow Sweden to join NATO. You had Turkey also get guarantees for F-16s itself from the United States, I believe, if not the collective West. And you also had Ukraine, the U.S. changing its tune completely now and saying it's going to give F-16s to Ukraine. And you had these amorphous security guarantees supposedly given to Ukraine, which really just means continue to give Ukraine weapons, and it's not going to change anything on the battlefield. So really what you had at the NATO summit was an utter and complete failure. You had NATO come into this thinking that this was going to be the time where it was going to be able to project some kind of pathway for Ukraine to get into NATO. And the only way it could do that is if Russia was on the ropes. But Russia isn't on the ropes. Russia right now is in a really good position, not just on the battlefield, but it is truly, as I said, geopolitics is about politics. And we have to look at not just how souped up and well-equipped Russia's military is, but how well-positioned is Russia in the world right now. And it's in a good position. Domestically, its political rule is consolidated and stabilized. Economically, it is actually going to surpass the 0.7% growth, the less than 1% growth projected by the IMF earlier last year. It is actually going to surpass that already in 2023. And this isn't to mention that Russia does not have ammunition shortages. It does not have shortages of any kind on the military front. And it still has many troops that it can deploy, despite the fact that just a couple of weeks ago, we had a so-called coup being staged by Wagner, led by Prigozhin, or at least a section of Wagner. Yet none of that, none of the sanctions, none of the quirks and developments that have come out of this special military operation, and nothing on the battlefield has changed the fact that Russia's position throughout this conflict has only strengthened. So NATO came into this already in a losing position. NATO came into this without the outcome that it wanted. If you remember last year, NATO essentially said that we're going to target two countries, Russia and China. Russia in the immediate sense, China later. China's malicious. Russia is the biggest threat right now. They repeated the same thing here without much changing on the scene, except Russia basically making work out of, in a war of attrition, making not quick work, but steady work out of Ukraine's military. It has gone through 1, 2, 3 Ukrainian militaries, and it hasn't lost one itself. So Zelensky lashing out in this way, and also the divides among the NATO states. Basically, you had the United States, you had Germany, you had France, you had some European countries say, we don't want direct confrontation with Russia. That's why we can't seem to agree on a pathway to membership. And I have to say, there isn't going to be NATO membership for Ukraine. Let's just be very honest here, because NATO membership for Ukraine is it's not just a red line for Russia, it's really the line. It is the reason why Russia is fighting this conflict. It is one of the principal, if not the principal reason, because what NATO membership would do, it would give these fascist, not, NAZI forces, it would give the Ukraine's government basically cover, full military cover from NATO, not just piecemeal, not just sending weapons, old weapons, not just sending it in piecemeal, but it would give a kind of responsibility, almost a diktat, to NATO countries to defend Ukraine by any means necessary. Now, of course, there are loopholes in that, because I think Article 5's language literally says if deemed necessary, meaning that I guess NATO could say, no, 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 this isn't necessary. Right? It might not fall into the same line as, let's say, what happened in Libya, when basically NATO went all in to drop tens of thousands of sorties on that African country to destroy it. Perhaps NATO would say, oh, this isn't deemed necessary because they know the consequences, regardless if Ukraine was a NATO member or not. But regardless of whether you believe that there's any kind of rationality in the brains of these neocon hawks, these neocon chicken hawks, I think is secondary to the reality that Ukraine knows, and I think NATO knows, that the only way Ukraine is going to survive this conflict is if Ukraine gets direct intervention from NATO. And that's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen right now, because the situation is just not ripe for that. It is not ripe for such an intervention. Russia is in too strong of a position. And there is that, I think, pesky reality that should that come about, what do you think is going to happen? Well, nuclear war is going to happen. And now I'm going to close on this story by talking about Turkey, because I think one of the most interesting things about this development here is that Turkey has essentially been, from the beginning, playing all sides. And I think that there's some unwarranted enthusiasm for Turkey, maybe some admiration for a political leader that may not deserve it so much, because Erdogan in Syria, and this is my litmus test, Erdogan in Syria was a disaster, right? Turkey was a disaster in that conflict, helped the U.S. occupy territory, helped smuggle that oil, still is, I believe. Well, I know that they had their cooling off period of late, but all the way up until this year, smuggling oil, smuggling resources, arming proxy groups, and working with the United States quite closely, especially in the intelligence realm, to essentially destroy that country. So we have to understand that Turkey has its own ambitions. While Turkey is definitely for a multipolar world to a certain extent, it does not want to see Russia fall or China fall. These are countries that are very important partners for Turkey, and certainly doesn't want to see them destabilize. And that's why it doesn't support the war wholesale against Russia or China. But at the same time, Turkey has its own ambitions. Turkey has a kind of Ottomanist imperialist vision. It has a vision to be its own kind of empire. It wants to be a regional power to a degree much greater than it is right now. And that's why Turkey just can't be trusted in that way. And Russia has known this for quite some time. Russia has known this from the beginning of NATO's encirclement of Russia, beginning more than a decade ago. And of course, what really spurred it to a great degree was the 2008 uh, um, Bush era indication that Ukraine was going to join NATO at some point. So Russia has been aware of Turkey's political situation and how it relates, and that it can't always be trusted. And we have to understand that this NATO summit brought out, I think, all of the contradictions. What happens in geopolitics, what happens in global politics, what happens in conflicts that involve uh, forces, right? The forces for multipolarity, self determination against the hegemonists, against the unipolarists, those who want to see essentially US and allied forces dominate the planet at the expense of the majority. When you have that conflict going on, there are always going to be moments that are incredibly acute that tell us exactly what moment we are in. And that was this NATO summit. You had Sweden join, which is a disaster for the world. It is only going to prolong not just the Ukraine conflict, but perhaps lead to more conflicts and only strengthen and firm up Russia's resolve to defend itself from NATO aggression, because Sweden is pretty close to Russia. It's a big disaster. It brings us that much closer to nuclear war. Then you also have the F-16s to Ukraine, and of course, F-16s out of Turkey. You have F-16s being thrown around. Who knows when they'll be usable? Congress has to pass them, I know, for Ukraine, Turkey, etc. I know that there are limitations, and I know that it's not going to change the battlefield outcome, but politically, what it tells Russia is NATO is in it, not to win it per se, but it's in it to prolong it, to wage permanent war. And that message is well received, and Russia is going to keep preparing in that way. And then, of course, you had Turkey over the last several weeks giving all indications that it is opening an embrace to the collective West and will be helping the collective West not just get Sweden into NATO, but perhaps get Ukraine into NATO. And that is a pretty big stab in the back to Russia, which has been a very fair partner, to Turkey. So these are the big developments. And of course, you had Zelensky's extremely embarrassing and humiliating outburst, and also his isolation. So you not only had him be invited to this summit, but he also had these outbursts and then seemed to be off in the corner. He seemed to be really in a sad place. And it just goes to show that no matter how much a puppet tries to become the puppet master, or perhaps becomes emboldened to demand from puppet masters things for which he cannot get, or for which they cannot get, it just goes to show that a puppet is a puppet is a puppet. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it is a duck. And that's what Zelensky is.